Session 13, Rapid Learning Techniques.
At the beginning of this seminar, we talked about human potential and about how the average person uses less than 10% of their potential, how Albert Einstein's brain was removed from his cranium when he died, and it was studied at Cornell University, and they found that he never used more than 15% of his mental potential in his entire lifetime, one of the great geniuses of this century. What does this mean, mental potential? Well, it means the ability to use our thinking capacity. It means the ability to activate the brain cells in what is called the neocortex, or the thinking brain of mankind. And one of the things we're going to talk about in this session is how you can use your brain more effectively, and some of the things that have been done to help people develop and learn rapid learning techniques, or what we call whole brain learning, accelerated learning, or even super learning. One of the things that we know is that the average person really uses not much more than 1 or 2% of their thinking capacity. That we don't use 10%, because if you could use 10% of your brain, you could accomplish anything you could dream of on this earth. Our role in this session is to show you how to use more of it. We know some things about the brain. We know one thing with regard to intelligence, is that intelligence is not a matter of IQ. Intelligence is a way of acting and a way of thinking. When we look at people who are apparently extremely intelligent, we find one thing. We find that they are not much more intelligent than you or I, but they have developed their intelligence. So let's put it this way. Intelligence is developed through effort. Intelligence is developed the same way that muscles are developed. A person who has an intelligence with regard to a business or a profession, a lawyer or a doctor or a business person, is not necessarily a person who was born with that genius. It's a person who has developed it as a result of years and years of study and practice. So look upon intelligence like a muscle. IQ is malleable. IQ, or percentage points, or mental ability, is malleable over a broad range. Remember, we talked about the case of positive expectations where one student's IQ jumped 25 points in the course of one school year. This is very common. We've had many cases on record where IQ points, in other words, the total thinking ability of an individual, has jumped 10, 20, 30 points as the result of a particular way of learning or a particular way of studying. And we'll talk about some of these ideas. So IQ is malleable over a broad range. What I'm saying is that you are far smarter than you know. You are far more intelligent than you've ever given yourself credit for. We also know that IQ is a matter of self-concept. There are many people who have been found to be extremely intelligent, but because they've been brought up in negative environments, had been convinced at an early age that they weren't particularly bright. One gentleman who was encouraged to leave school in the 10th grade because they felt he was a complete academic failure was turned out later to have an IQ of 175 when he tried to enlist in the Army. After he got out of the Army, he started 6 businesses and became a multi-millionaire by the age of 28 because they proved to him that he was brilliant. The reason he didn't pay attention in school was not because he didn't have the intelligence, but because he learned everything the first time it was mentioned, and he was totally bored. You find that many people are far smarter than they realize but as a result of previous experiences, their self-concept has them functioning at levels far below their intelligence, and that is true for you in almost every single case. Now, another important point is learning ability is malleable. Learning ability is malleable. What does that mean? Well, malleable means it can be shaped. It can be bent. It's like a metal that can be bent and pounded. Learning ability is malleable in that you can learn to learn. Wonderful thing is that human beings are learning creatures. You can learn to learn whatever you want. And the more you learn, the more we have found, the greater capacity you have to learn. Is that learning ability is like a muscle. The more you stretch it, the more you use it, the greater its capacity becomes. The more you learn math, the more capable you are of learning history. The more you study philosophy, the more capable you are of learning psychology. That your capacity to learn expands as you learn any subject. Now, another important point, too, with regard to learning, is that if you want to earn more, you have to learn more. If you want to earn more, you have to learn more. This is one of the most important, simple, trite little expressions that you'll ever hear, is that we live in a knowledge-based world, and your external world of earnings will be a direct reflection of the amount of useful knowledge that you take in. So if you're like me, you're probably impatient, and you probably would like to know how to learn more faster so that you can earn more faster, and that's what we're going to talk about. Our third point, by the way, is a direct relationship between longevity and learning. is that we find that the more active your mind is, the longer you live. That whenever you see cases of people beginning to develop senility in their early 60s, you see an example of a person who stopped reading a long time ago and started watching a lot of television. Senior citizens in America watch an average of 7 hours of television per day. And what it does is it makes their mind very, very passive. Their brain begins to atrophy. Their reflexes, their intelligence, their ability to respond and to be alert to their environment begins to deteriorate. The longer you learn, the longer you study, the more active you keep mentally, the more energy you have, the more vitality, the healthier you are. In fact, if you look at the lives of the great creative men and women like Goethe, began the composition of the second part of Faust when he was 85. Grandma Moses started painting at the age of 75 and was still painting at the age of 100. Albert Schweitzer, whom I worked with in Africa, was still working a full day at the age of 91, when most of the people, if not all the people he had grown up with, had been in their graves for decades. So if for no other reason than the fact that you want to live forever, is you must become an active, intelligent learner. You must develop the capacity to learn. You must learn how to learn. Now, a few years ago, back in the 50s in Bulgaria, a man named Georgy Lozanov began some experiments that have had a tremendous, Lozanov have had a tremendous influence on our thinking in the Western world in the last couple of decades. A tremendous book has been written on his work called Super Learning, talking about the results of his experiments. And Lozanov began studying the fact that information was exploding at such a rate that nobody could keep current on their field anymore. That no matter what field you were in, tens, hundreds, even thousands of articles were being written every year, that nobody could absorb the information. So he became preoccupied with the need to create a way for people to learn more rapidly. He called his system accelerated learning. We call it rapid learning. Some people call it super learning. It means the same thing. It means how can you take in more information at a faster rate? And what Lozanov found was this. He began as a pioneer of whole brain research. He found that there are really two hemispheres of the brain, and the two hemispheres of the brain perform different functions, and that people who learn the very best are capable of harmonizing and using both hemispheres of the brain. If the left hemisphere is responsible for certain functions, the right is responsible for certain functions. He also found that there's a massive tissue that divides the brains called the corpus callosum, and that children up to the age of 5 or 6 learn at about 25 times the adult rate. And his thoughts were, would it be possible to recreate the conditions that exist in early childhood that enable children to learn at a fantastic rate of speed in adult life? And so he found that in looking at the functions of the brains, he found that the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere were responsible for very different ways of thinking. Let me give you some examples. For instance, the left hemisphere is verbal. It thinks in terms of words. The right hemisphere is pictorial or artistic. It thinks in terms of pictures. The left hemisphere is analytical, whereas the right hemisphere is holistic. It sees all the facts and information. It sees the big picture, if you like. The left hemisphere is pragmatic. It's very matter-of-factual. The right hemisphere is intuitive and is the seat of intuition and feelings. The left hemisphere is concrete. It likes to see things that it can count, touch, taste, and feel. The left hemisphere, the right hemisphere is abstract. It's responsible for abstract concepts, scientific concepts, artistic or philosophic concepts. The left hemisphere is linear, in that it sees things in an orderly row, and it is also sequential, and likes to take things one thing at a time. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is musical and artistic, if you like, and spontaneous, and is responsible for humor. The left hemisphere is responsible for language, the stringing together of words in a logical order to make sentences. It's also responsible for math. The right hemisphere is responsible for dance and for poetry. And these two hemispheres, in order to work properly, have to be harmonized. But they have very, very different functions. And when Lozanov did his research, he found another thing, is that when he studied the way that people learned, he found that people learned at different levels of brainwave activities and as a result of different things. For instance, he found that the brain functions at 4 different levels. And the first level is what is called the beta level. The beta level is 14 waves per second or above. The beta level is normal waking. This is where you and I are. Whenever our mind is very active, very intense, our brainwave activity, or what is called cycles, our brainwave activity is very frantic. This is where most of us spend most of our time. It's also the time where we learn the least efficiently. He said he found that below beta was the alpha level. The alpha level was 8 to 13 waves or cycles per second. And this was a more, if you like, modulated wave level, and he found that we have a tendency to learn in this stage. This is the deep relaxation stage. This is the stage that we're in when we're sitting deeply relaxed, when we're daydreaming, if you like, or prior to going to sleep, we drop into this level. Just below the alpha level is what is called the theta level. The theta level is 5 to 7 waves per second. The theta level has, again, bigger waves, and this theta level is where we just are starting to drop into dreaming. It's called the hallucinatory or illusionary area, where we're starting to have dreams just before we fall asleep. Have you ever had the experience of being woken up just as you're falling asleep and being jerked out suddenly from this theta level? You weren't into delta, you weren't sound asleep, and you notice how jarring it is. But what Lozanov found was the alpha theta level. This level in here is where we do our best learning. And that when we are learning at this level, our ability to learn is dramatically increased. And just below theta is delta, and delta is 1/2 to 4 waves per second. And these are long waves, if you like. Now, of course, below 1/2 a wave per second, you are no longer working. As a matter of fact, the cessation of brainwave activity on electroencephalogram is one of the clinical definitions of death. Now, what Lozanov tried to do was he said, would it be possible to bring people down from beta, where they're awake, into this alpha theta level and somehow activate the right and the left brains so that they work simultaneously? And he came up with a method using music and relaxation. And he began his experiments back in 1965-66 in Bulgaria. One of the most interesting experiments, he started off with language, and the language he chose was the language of French. Now, if you were to take a French course at your local university as an adult, you would be expected in a 3-hour period, and 3 hours seems to be the ideal study period for a language. You would be expected in 3 hours to learn approximately 25 to 40 words. And you'd be expected to have a retention level up until the final exam with due study and so on of about 80% and maybe less. As a matter of fact, what Lozanov found, he said that most of the ways that we learn in our society are so inefficient as to be deplorable, in that the average person who gets a university degree in our society after 4 years and $25,000 to $50,000 of expenses forgets 80 to 90% of everything they learned at the university before the summer after the university, the final year, is over. As a matter of fact, as much as 80% is lost in the first 30 days. It was been postulated by a couple of university professors. If you want to clear out most of the universities in the country, very simple way to do it, is call everybody back 48 hours after final exams to rewrite without notice. And you would find that the traditional way of learning, which is to cram the brain with as much information as possible and to rush into the exam room and regurgitate the information onto the exam and then go back and recover and do it over again, this way of learning is so inefficient that almost all the information we take in that way is lost completely. That's why if you took a language course in school and then you ever went to one of the countries where they spoke the language, you found that you probably couldn't remember more than 3 or 4 words, and even those you had wrong. Well, so Lozanov decided to use music and relaxation, and this is what he did. Under very closely controlled conditions, he brought in 60 students. These 60 students were drawn from a variety of occupations. None of them had any knowledge of French at all. They were very closely monitored and screened by people who were not favorable toward this experiment. So it was very rigorously controlled. In 1966, he brought in these 60 people, and he felt that he would have to greatly increase the average level of learning in order to get approval for the establishment of his Institute of Suggestology. The Institute of Suggestology and Suggestopedia was subsequently set up in Sofia, Bulgaria. What he did is he took these people, and we had 60 people, and his goal was to get them to 150 words per session, 100 to 150 words per session with higher levels of retention. What they did is they brought them in, they played gentle, relaxing music, they turned down the lights, and they read them the words on cards with the French on one side, the Bulgarian on the other. And as they read them the words, the students repeated the words in a deeply relaxed state, and they brought them up to a state of full awareness and reviewed the words and then tested them on it. They found from the very beginning 3 sessions. First of all, review in aware state. Second of all, listening to the words in deep relaxation. Third of all, review in an aware state again. They found that from the very first session, they were getting 98% retention. In that, in testing at the end of each session, they were remembering 98% of what they learned. They conducted this experiment for 6 weeks, and every single student in the class got up to a 98% retention rate with no experience in the language at all. Now, before they disbanded this experiment in '66, he called for volunteers and got 15 more. 15 of these students volunteered, and they said, would it be possible to learn 500 words in one day? Well, they came in on a Saturday. They worked all day because nobody in recorded history had ever learned 500 words in a day. And at the end of the day, they tested out at 98% retention on 500 words. Now, an interesting point is that many of these people were suffering nervous disorders. As a matter of fact, 40% of them were drawn from the registers of psychologists and psychiatrists. And after this 6-week learning period, learning 150 words a day, almost every one of them was completely better. That there was no stress in this type of learning, that it was very, very relaxing, that they found that it cleared their minds and they felt wonderful afterwards, as opposed to our current way of learning, which is so stressful and so tense and so competitive. They found that after this 500 words, at the end of the day, everybody felt great. There was no stress, no fatigue, nothing. Well, he said, let's see if it's possible to increase this before we disband the experiment. And he called back 12 of the students, the best learners. 2 weeks later, they got together to see if they could learn 1,000 words in one day. 1,000 brand new words in one day. The result of it was that at the end of the day, they were able to learn the 1,000 words and test out at 98%. Interesting, later on, about 6 months later, they brought these students all back to see how much of the language they had retained with no opportunity to read in it, no opportunity to speak it. They found that they tested out at 69% recall without any review, and with one review, the entire class was back up to 98%. In other words, this method of music with a deep relaxation, dropping into alpha theta and activating both brains had led to a dramatic increase in learning ability. Now, in 1974, Lozanov, under a controlled experiment, got the rate up to 1,800 words in one day with 98% retention. In 1979, in a special experiment with selected students, Lozanov got the rate up to 3,000 words in one day. In other words, by activating the brain and with still 98% retention. Now, this is a phenomenal thing. It's almost an unheard of thing to believe. But what Lozanov has found is that the learning capacity of the brain is infinite. That the capacity of your brain to learn and to take in information. For example, if you speak English well, you probably speak and use about 1,200 to 2,000 words in the course of your day-to-day life. All you need is 2,000 words to be functionally fluent in any language. The average English-speaking person uses less than 1,200 words. As a matter of fact, some people, and especially as you go down the educational ladder, use sometimes less than 500 words in their entire language. But 2,000 words will enable you to read any newspaper, any magazine, watch any program, radio, television, except something of a technical nature. What Lozanov proved was that it's possible for a person to learn one language per day, permanently. Now, this learning technology is beginning to change the way that we learn. It's beginning to revolutionize all of our understandings about language. Lozanov has also developed many other techniques and understandings. He found that gentle classical music is a critical part of this learning. That Baroque music, the 60-beat Baroque that slows down the heart rate and slows down the brainwave activity rate so that the body and the mind get into sync with the music and the incoming information is critical. That you can learn technical subjects, you can learn medicine, philosophy, psychology. I have taken extended courses now in accelerated or optimal learning to learn these methodologies. And what I have found is that you can learn, even without any of the science or technology, you can learn things very, very rapidly if you'll do 2 or 3 things. Here are the keys to speeding up the way that you learn. Number 1 is define what it is you want to learn and need to learn in order to be more successful and more effective. You cannot learn something that you're not interested in. You cannot learn something that does not hold your attention. You cannot learn something that is boring. So make sure that what you're studying is important to you. So number 1 is to define it. And when you begin to study, define your purpose. Why are you learning this subject? Think it through, read it through, study it, and only study things with an aim in mind. Remember, you have to have a goal. Number 2 is you must have an intense desire to learn. You must have a desire. In other words, you cannot learn because somebody else wants you to learn. Number 3 is always study, when you can, with classical music. Gentle classical music with no words. Gentle classical music of any kind, especially music from the classical period of Mozart, Bach, Brahms, Dvorak, Beethoven, and Stravinsky, for instance. These composers have a classical 60-beat Baroque backbeat within their music. And if you play with classical music or even environmental sounds like the sounds of waves or the oceans, white music as it's called, you have that in the background, it relaxes the brain, it opens the left and the right hemisphere, and it allows information to come in through the left brain and be internalized into the right brain where it is stored in the seat of memory. So what you want to do is through music, you want to relax the corpus callosum, relax the brain so that information can flow in through the left brain and into the right. A 4th key point is spaced repetitions. Spaced repetition is important. Now, some people say, why is it, or how is it that I can give a seminar like this all day without notes? And I sometimes do day after day after day of seminars without notes. I must have a great memory. I don't have a great memory. I just study all the time, and I use spaced repetition, and I review it over and over again. There's another thing, too, by the way, is that the more you learn, the more you learn. When you start to study, remember that it takes practice to learn how to learn. It takes practice, practice, practice. Is that the more you practice learning how to learn, the more likely it is that you'll learn. The first few days when you're studying a new subject, you'll find it takes tremendous effort. Now, here's another important point, and that is variety. Variety of stimulation is critical. The number of different ways that you stimulate your mind, different books, different magazines, plays, different exposures to different conversations, different subjects, and so on. If you bombard your mind continuously with stimuli that challenges your mind, you will find that you'll develop the capacity to learn and remember more. And number 7 is remember this. It's called attention span. Is the time when you learn the most is at the beginning of a period of study and at the end of a period of study. What does this tell you? It tells you that instead of studying or reading for a long period of time like this, say 2 or 3 hours, what you do is break it up and take several breaks so that you have a series of breaks. And you'll always remember what you learn at the beginning of the break, at the beginning of the period, at the end of the period, the beginning and end. So the more breaks that you can take, the more variety that you can put into your studying, the faster you'll learn. The key to remember this is that everything that you are or ever will become is going to be as the result of the information you take into your mind, the practical, usable information that you can take and use to bring about some kind of improvement in the world around you. If you want to earn more, you have to learn more. If you want to be happier, you have to learn more. If you want to realize your full potential as a human being, you have to learn more, which means read, study, and learn how to learn. And if you'll do that, you'll be amazed at how much of your mental potential you can release.